The chalk line snapped against the raw cedar, sending a microscopic cloud of blue dust into the heavy afternoon air. I kept my thumb pressed against the wood, checking the grain. It was dense, straight, predictable. I liked things that made sense. What didn't make sense was the neon orange sticker plastered to the front door of the house next to mine. I wiped the sawdust from my gray t-shirt and set the block plane down on my workbench. From my driveway, I had a clear view of Avery's property. The house was an older craftsman, a rare build in this subdivision, but it was showing its age. The front porch had a subtle sag, and the wooden fence dividing our yards leaned a few degrees off plumb. The neon sticker was an HOA citation. A heavy metallic thud echoed from Avery's backyard. I walked the length of my driveway, stepping over a coiled air hose, and approached the property line. The wooden fence between us was weathered gray, the pickets rough under my forearms as I leaned my weight against the top rail. The late afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across the grass. Avery was wrestling with a rusted metal trash can, her jaw set tight. She wore a white, short-sleeved button-down top, the collar slightly askew, the fabric catching the golden hour light. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from missing an hour of sleep, but the kind that settles in the bones. She abandoned the trash can when she saw me. She walked over to the fence, planting her elbows on the top rail directly across from me. She leaned in, resting her chin near her hands. A slight guarded smile touched her mouth completely, at odds with the tension around her eyes. "I saw you bring a girl home last night," she said. Her voice was steady, a deliberate attempt at casual banter to mask whatever was grinding her down. I stayed perfectly still, letting the silence stretch for a second. The wood of the fence dug slightly into my forearms. I met her gaze, keeping my expression entirely neutral, before letting the corner of my mouth edge upward. "Are you jealous?" I asked. She let out a short, quiet exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. "Curious. You usually only bring lumber into that driveway. I was starting to think you were building a wooden bride in that garage. My younger sister, Maya," I said, keeping my voice level. "Her apartment flooded. She's crashing in my guest room until the drywall is replaced." "Ah." Avery looked down at the fence line, her fingers picking absently at a splinter of dry wood. The playful energy drained out of her, leaving the exhaustion visible again. "Well, it's good you have space for her." "What's the orange sticker, Avery?" I didn't frame it as a gentle inquiry. I just stated the fact. Her shoulders dropped. She stopped picking at the wood. "Mrs. Higgins, the HOA board did a drive-by. They're claiming the front porch structure is a safety hazard, and the fence violates the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. I have 14 days to bring it all up to code, or they start fining me $200 a day. 14 days isn't enough time to source the lumber, let alone secure a contractor right now." "I know." She looked at the rusted trash can, then back to me. "I don't have the money for a contractor anyway. I'm going to have to figure out how to brace the porch myself." "You're a designer. You draw the plans. You don't frame the loads." "I'll learn." Her chin lifted. It was a clear boundary. She wasn't asking for a savior. "You don't have the tools," I pointed out, my voice flat. "I'll rent them." I looked at the sagging porch roof. The structural columns were water damaged at the base. One good storm and the overhang would shear off the ledger board. I looked back at Avery. She was gripping the fence tight enough that her knuckles were pale. "I'll do the labor," I said. "You pay for the materials." She frowned, stepping back half a pace. "Gabriel, no. You run a custom furniture business. Your hourly rate is probably more than my car is worth. I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask. I offered." I tapped my knuckles against the top rail of the fence. "I'm not doing it for free. You're going to draft the plans for my new workshop expansion. Trade for trade. Equal value." It wasn't equal, and we both knew it. But the structure of the deal mattered. It gave her solid ground to stand on. She studied my face, searching for pity. I made sure she found none. I just gave her a steady, calculating look. "Trade for trade," she finally echoed. The tension in her jaw eased a fraction of an inch. "Okay. When do we start?" "Tomorrow at 6. I'll pull the permits." I pushed off the fence and walked back to my shop. I didn't look back, but I listened. I heard her let out a long, shaky breath. The sound of that breath settling into quiet relief felt heavier than any piece of timber I'd carried all week. At 5:45 the next morning, the air was still cool and smelled of dew and wet asphalt. I walked across the damp grass to her front porch, carrying a DeWalt transit level and a pry bar. Avery was already outside, holding a mug of coffee, wearing a heavy canvas jacket over her clothes. "You're early," she said. "I like to measure in the quiet." I set the transit level on its tripod. "Hold this." I handed her the dumb end of the tape measure. She took it without a word, walking to the far corner of the porch. We spent the next hour in functional silence. I called out numbers. She wrote them down on a clipboard. I didn't try to fill the air with small talk. The work was the conversation. I checked the ledger board attached to the house. The lag bolts were completely rusted through. "This is worse than it looks," I told her, shining my flashlight into the gap between the wood and the brick. "The water barrier failed. The rot goes into the rim joist." Avery closed her eyes for a second. "How bad?" "Bad enough that Higgins isn't wrong about the safety hazard. But I can sister a new joist to the existing frame and flash it properly." I kept the explanation short. "It'll hold." She looked at the rotted wood, then at me. "Can we do it in 14 days? "We'll do it in 10. Over the next 4 days, my driveway became a staging ground. I set up my miter saw and sawhorses. The rhythm of the work created a structured proximity between us. Avery was there every time I turned off the saw. She didn't hover, but she made herself useful. She cleared debris, held boards steady when I needed a second pair of hands, and swept the sawdust from the concrete. I found myself watching her when I should have been checking my angles. I noticed how she tied her hair back with a piece of scrap wire she found in my toolbox. I noticed the way she organized the screws by length without me asking. I kept my distance physically and verbally. If I needed to pass her a tool, I made sure my fingers didn't brush hers. On the 5th afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, threatening a heavy summer storm. I was cutting the final decorative corbels for the porch posts. I needed to finish the cuts before the rain hit. I was entirely focused on the blade when a sleek silver sedan pulled up to the curb, parking illegally in front of the fire hydrant. Mrs. Higgins stepped out, clutching a clipboard. She marched up Avery's walkway, dodging the stack of new lumber. "Miss Bell?" Higgins' voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I powered down the saw. The sudden silence in the yard felt heavy. Avery wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped off the unfinished porch. "Mrs. Higgins, we're well within the 14-day window. The board has received complaints about the noise." Higgins said, her eyes sweeping over the scattered tools and the exposed framing of the porch. "And this looks like a major structural alteration. Did you submit the architectural review forms?" "It's a repair, not an alteration." Avery said, her voice tight. "We are replacing rotten wood with identical dimensions. It requires a permit and a board review." Higgins insisted, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "I'm issuing a stop work order until the board convenes next month. If you continue, you will be fined." Avery froze. A stop work order meant leaving the porch exposed to the incoming storm. It meant the water damage would spread into the house. I saw her hand drop to her side, her fingers curling inward. I set down my speed square. I walked over, stepping between Higgins and Avery. I didn't crowd the HOA president, but I used my height and my stillness to change the gravity of the space. "Mrs. Higgins," I said. My voice was calm, a low, steady baseline. Section 4, Paragraph B of the Municipal Building Code. Higgins blinked, taking a half-step back. "Excuse me. Emergency stabilization of a failing load-bearing structure does not require a pre-approved architectural review if the failure presents an immediate risk to the primary dwelling." I pointed to the exposed rim joist. "The ledger board failed. If the storm hits tonight and this porch isn't secured, the roof load will tear the brick fascia off the house. That's an emergency stabilization." Higgins stared at the exposed wood. She didn't know what a ledger board was, but she recognized absolute certainty when she heard it. "I am a licensed contractor." I continued pulling my state license card from my wallet and holding it out. "Permit number is filed with the city as of Tuesday. If you issue a stop work order on an emergency stabilization and the house suffers structural damage, the HOA board assumes liability for the repair costs." Higgins looked at the card and then at the sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance. She didn't take the card. 14 days, Mr. Simmons." She snapped, pivoting on her heel. "If it is not aesthetically complete by the deadline, the fines begin." She marched back to her car and drove away. The silence returned heavier this time. I turned to Avery. She was staring at the spot where Higgins' car had been. A slight tremor ran through her shoulders. "Hey," I said quietly. She looked at me. "Liability. You just threatened the HOA board with a lawsuit you can't back up." "I can back it up." The code citation was real. I picked up my speed square. "We need to get the flashing taped before the rain starts." She didn't move toward the tools. Instead, she sat down on the bottom step of the unfinished porch, pulling her knees to her chest. "She's not going to stop. Even if we finish the porch, she'll find something else. The grass is too long. The paint is the wrong shade of white." I walked over and stood near the steps. I didn't sit down beside her. I stayed on my feet, giving her the physical space she needed, but remaining entirely present. "Why does this house matter so much?" I asked. It was a direct question, no softening. Avery rested her forehead against her knees. "My grandfather built the cabinets in the kitchen. My dad planted the oak tree in the back. When everything else went wrong, when my firm downsized, when my ex left, this house was the only thing that didn't move. It's the only anchor I have." She looked up, her eyes bright, but refusing to spill over. "If they fine me, I lose it. I can't afford the property taxes and the fines." I looked at the house. I saw the slight imperfections in the brickwork, the way the roof line sagged just a fraction. It was a flawed structure, but it was hers. "You aren't going to lose it," I said. "You can't promise that, Gabriel." "I don't make promises I can't build," I told her. "Grab the flashing tape. We have work to do." The storm hit an hour later, a brutal downpour that turned the yard to mud. We worked through it. I secured the heavy timber posts while she held the level, the rain soaking through our clothes. We didn't speak. The roar of the water hitting the roof drowned out everything else. When the final bolt was torqued down, I stepped back under the dry cover of the newly secured porch roof. Avery stood next to me, shivering slightly, her hair plastered to her neck. I looked at her. Rainwater traced down the collar of her jacket. My hand flexed once at my side, then I slid both hands into my pockets and kept my place. "It's solid," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. She reached out and placed her hand flat against the massive cedar post I had just installed. "It is." She turned her head, looking at me. "Thank you for not letting her stop the work. I don't like bullies who use clipboards," I said. She smiled, a real unguarded smile that reached her eyes. The rain hammered on the new roof above us, but the grinding tension in my jaw released. My shoulders dropped, and the next breath I pulled in landed level. The next morning, the sun was brutal, baking the mud into cracked earth. I was in my driveway sanding the final trim pieces for the porch when my sister Maya walked out of my house holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You're working entirely too hard for a trade agreement," Maya observed, setting a mug on my workbench. She leaned against the doorframe watching Avery's house. "She's nice. She's a neighbor." I kept the sander moving. "Right. And you always rebuild load-bearing structures for neighbors." Maya took a sip of her coffee. "You know Higgins was asking around about you yesterday. Talking to Mr. Wallace down the street. Asking if your commercial workshop variance was up to date." I stopped the sander. The vibration lingered in my hands. "My variance is bulletproof. Doesn't mean she can't make your life miserable with inspections," Maya pointed out. "If she ties up your shop with complaints, you can't fulfill your client orders. You lose money, Gabe." I wiped the sawdust from the trim board. "I'll handle Higgins." "Don't handle it by setting yourself on fire to keep her house warm," Maya warned softly. She didn't push it further, just turned and went back inside. I looked across the property line. Avery was on the porch painting the new railings white. She was methodical, careful. I saw the way she stopped to stretch her back, the visible toll the stress was taking on her. I wasn't going to let Higgins take that house. 2 days before the HOA deadline, the trap snapped shut. I was at the hardware store when my phone vibrated. It was Avery. "Gabriel, you need to come back." Her voice was dead flat. I dropped the box of screws I was holding, walked out of the store, and drove back to the neighborhood. Avery was standing in her driveway, holding a thick manila envelope. The porch was finished, painted, and perfect. The yard was clean. But the look on her face told me the aesthetics didn't matter. I parked the truck and walked over. "What is it?" She handed me the envelope. They moved the goalposts. I pulled out the documents. It was a formal notice from the HOA board. It wasn't about the porch. It was about the property line. They ordered a new survey of the subdivision last month. Avery said, her voice hollow. "According to this, the wooden fence dividing our yards was built 2 feet onto my property line by the previous owner. It's a non-conforming structure. Because it's on my deeded land, I am responsible for it. They are demanding I tear it down and replace it with wrought iron to match the new neighborhood aesthetic, or face a $500 immediate fine plus daily penalties." I looked at the survey map. The fence was old, likely built 40 years ago. "Wrought iron for 100 linear feet is $10,000, she whispered. "I don't have it. I can't borrow it. I'm done, Gabriel. They won." "No, they didn't." I folded the papers and handed them back. "I'll tear the fence down tomorrow." She shook her head, stepping away from me. "And then, what I have an open yard that violates the enclosure rule. They fine me for that instead. You can't fix this with a hammer, Gabriel. It's paperwork. It's money." She crossed her arms, pulling them tight, as if she could hold the impact inside her own frame. She kept her eyes off mine and stared past my shoulder toward my shop. "You need to walk away. If you keep fighting Higgins for me, she's going to go after your shop permits," Maya told me. Maya talks too much. Maya is right. Avery swallowed and then took another step back. "I am not your responsibility. You rebuilt my porch. You paid your imaginary trade debt. You don't owe me anything else. Stop trying to shield me." I didn't argue. I didn't offer a motivational speech. I just looked at her, steady and unmoving. "I'll be here tomorrow at 6 to tear down the fence," I said. I turned and walked back to my shop. I spent the next 4 hours at my desk, not with wood, but with the municipal zoning code, the HOA bylaws, and a pot of black coffee. I read every clause, every footnote. I didn't need a hammer. I needed leverage. At 2 a.m. I found it. The next evening was the monthly HOA board meeting held in the community clubhouse at the entrance to the subdivision. The room was aggressively air-conditioned, smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. About 20 residents were seated in folding chairs. Mrs. Higgins sat at a folding table at the front, flanked by 2 silent board members. I stood in the back of the room, leaning against the wall. I wore a clean button-down shirt, my work boots swapped for dark shoes. Avery walked in 5 minutes late. She looked pale but resolute. She held the manila envelope in her hands. She saw me standing in the back, her steps faltering for a fraction of a second, before she squared her shoulders and walked to an empty chair in the second row. She didn't sit down. Higgins banged a small wooden gavel. Next item. The property line violation at 442 Elm Street. Miss Bell. Avery stood straight. She didn't look back at me. Mrs. Higgins, the survey you provided is accurate. The fence is on my property. However, forcing a resident to replace a legacy structure with $10,000 of wrought iron with 3 days' notice is predatory. The rules are the rules, Miss Bell. Higgins said smoothly, adjusting her glasses. The board voted on the aesthetic guidelines unanimously. If you cannot maintain the property to the standard of the neighborhood, perhaps you should consider selling. I know several buyers looking for lots. There it was. Higgins wanted the house emptied and sold. Avery gripped the envelope. She was out of options, but she stood her ground, refusing to look intimidated. I pushed off the wall and walked down the center aisle. The room went quiet as I stopped beside Avery's chair. I didn't look at her. I kept my focus entirely on the table at the front. Mrs. Higgins, I said. My voice was pitched to carry to the back of the room, calm and absolute. Mr. Simmons, you do not have the floor, Higgins snapped. I'm yielding my time to him. Avery said instantly, her voice clear. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my pocket and laid it flat on the folding table in front of Higgins. I reviewed the new survey you commissioned, I said. It's highly accurate. It confirms the fence at 442 Elm is 2 feet onto Miss Bell's property. I tapped the paper. It also confirms that the community clubhouse we are currently standing in was built over the municipal utility easement by exactly 4 feet. The silence in the room became absolute. The 2 silent board members sat up straight. That's absurd, Higgins said, her face flushing. It's public record, I corrected. Section 12 of the Municipal Code states that any permanent structure built over an active utility easement must be demolished at the owner's expense if it impedes access. The owner in this case is the HOA. I placed a second piece of paper on the table. I took the liberty of filling out the code violation report for the city inspector. I haven't filed it yet. Higgins stared at the report. One board member reached for the survey map. The other stopped, pretending not to care. What do you want, Simmons? Higgins asked, her voice a harsh whisper. A grandfather clause. I said, my voice perfectly level. Miss Bell's fence is a legacy structure. You will issue a formal waiver in writing exempting the property at 442 Elm from the new aesthetic requirements, as long as the current structures are maintained in safe condition. Furthermore, you will cease all targeted inspections of my commercial workshop. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just presented the terms of surrender. Higgins looked at the survey map, then at the code violation report. She looked at the 20 residents watching her. She had no moves left. She pulled a pen from her pocket, grabbed a piece of official HOA letterhead, and began to write. She signed it, stamped it, and shoved it across the table. I picked it up, verified the language, and handed it to Avery. Meeting adjourned. Higgins snapped, standing up and walking out the side door. The residents began to murmur, packing up their things. I turned to Avery. She was staring at the waiver in her hands, her breath coming in slightly shallow gasps. Let's go home, I said quietly. We walked back to our street in the dark. The summer air was thick and warm. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the hum of the streetlights. We stopped on the sidewalk between our two driveways. Avery looked up at me. The street lamp cast a warm glow across her face. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by something steady. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice soft. You risked a war with the board for me. There is no war, it's just paperwork. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object. I held it out to her. It was a piece of the old weathered wood from her fence, the part she had been picking at the day I walked over. I had sanded it down to a smooth finish, oiled it, and carved the house number 442 into the grain. The fence stays, I told her, but it needed a repair. She took the small piece of wood. Her fingers brushed my palm, a brief grounding contact. She looked at the carved numbers, then looked up at me. You fix things, she whispered. Even the things I tell you not to. I only fix what's structurally sound, I said. She stepped closer. It was a deliberate, unhurried movement. She didn't close the distance in a rush of adrenaline. She closed it like someone arriving where she had meant to go all along. She rested her free hand flat against the center of my chest, over my heart. I placed my hand over hers, pressing it gently against my chest. I didn't pull her in. I just held my ground and let her decide the next inch. Her thumb shifted once against my shirt. She tipped her face up and stayed there, eyes on mine, waiting without retreat. I leaned down and I kissed her. It was steady, grounded, and certain. It felt like locking a load-bearing beam into its final place. When I pulled back, I kept my forehead resting against hers for a long moment. I breathed in the night air and the faint trace of cedar. The walls of my workshop had always been enough to fill a day. Standing there with her hand still spread against my chest, I looked past her shoulder at the porch, the fence, the house number in her palm, and knew exactly where I wanted to be when the next storm came. 2 weeks later, the yards were quiet. The neon sticker was a distant memory. We dragged my heavy wooden workbench out of the garage and set it up in the driveway, using it as a serving table for a small neighborhood barbecue. Mr. Wallace was sitting in a lawn chair, talking to Maya. The grill was going, the smoke drifting up into the oak tree. Avery stood near the edge of the driveway, laughing at something Mr. Wallace said. She looked relaxed, her hair loose, the tension completely gone from her shoulders. I stood by the grill, holding a pair of tongs, just watching her. She caught my eye across the yard. She didn't look away. She smiled, then crossed the space between us and leaned her shoulder against my arm, a simple public choice that needed no explanation. I rested my hand on the small of her back, feeling the steady warmth of her presence. The foundation was set. The work was done. The strongest people are not the ones who make the most noise. They are the ones who show up, stay steady, and solve the right problem when pressure hits. A real green flag is someone whose care has structure, restraint, and follow-through. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.